What would you do if a child grabbed your sleeve in a snowstorm and told you his baby sister was dying? Most people would hesitate. Thomas did not. And that single decision would dismantle the life he thought he wanted and rebuild something far greater in its place. The December wind moved through the city like something with a grudge. Thomas walked through Henderson Park with his collar up and his thoughts still tangled in a board meeting that had run 2 hours over schedule. At 38, he had turned a startup into a multi-million-dollar technology company. He had the penthouse, the suits, the reputation. He also had an ex-wife in California, a daughter he saw only during school breaks, and an apartment so quiet at night that he sometimes left the television on just to hear another voice. Wealthy by every measure the world uses to count wealth. Deeply, quietly lonely, in all the ways the world doesn't count. That's when the boy spoke. "Excuse me, sir." He was maybe 7 or 8. A tan jacket far too thin for December. Jeans worn through at the knees. His brown hair damp with snow, cheeks gone deep red from the cold. But none of that was what stopped Thomas. It was his eyes, wide, frightened, and working so hard to hold themselves together. "Sir, my baby sister is freezing. I don't know what to do." The baby in his arms was a few months old at most. Her tiny face was scrunched and red, and her cries were going quiet. Thomas knew instinctively, from the dormant part of his brain that had once been a father of an infant, that quiet is the sign you never want to see in a freezing baby. When a baby stops crying in the cold, it doesn't mean they've calmed down. It means their body is running out of the energy it takes to cry. That silence is a warning. Thomas was already pulling off his coat before he finished processing any of this. "Where are your parents?" he asked, wrapping the cashmere around both children. "Mum left us here. She said she'd be right back." That was before it got dark. The brave face was coming apart. "I tried to keep Sarah warm, but she's getting quiet now." "Mum said that's bad." "You're right. That is bad. What's your name?" "Timothy." "Tim." "Okay, Tim. I'm Thomas. We need to get you and Sarah somewhere warm right now. Will you come with me?" Tim hesitated. He had been taught well, don't talk to strangers, and he held on to that rule even in a blizzard with a freezing infant in his arms. Because instructions from a parent feel like a lifeline even when the parent is gone. But Tim was also smart enough to recognize when the old rules no longer fit the new situation. That is not a small thing. Most adults struggle with it their whole lives. "I promise I'm safe," Thomas said. "I have a daughter myself. If she were in trouble, I'd want someone to help her." Tim nodded. The tears came then, as if they'd been waiting for permission. Thomas carried Sarah and moved fast. His apartment was 6 blocks away. The hospital was 10. He chose closer. Tim walked beside him with one hand wrapped around Thomas's sleeve, not letting go the whole way. By the time they reached the apartment, Thomas had stripped off his jacket and was rubbing Sarah's tiny hands between his palms, talking to her softly. "Come on, little one. Stay with me. You're safe now." Tim brought armfuls of blankets from the bedroom. When asked, and together, they built a warm nest on the couch. The doorman had already called the doctor and the police. 15 minutes later, Thomas's physician arrived with his bag. 2 officers followed shortly after. While the doctor worked, Thomas sat with Tim in the kitchen and wrapped the boy's hands around a mug of hot chocolate. "You did everything right," he said. "You kept your sister as warm as you could, and you asked for help when she needed it. That was brave. This is worth carrying with you." Knowing when to ask for help is not weakness. It is a form of intelligence. Tim was 7 years old and understood that pride had no place in a crisis. How many adults spend years refusing to ask for help while the thing they love most grows cold? Detective Chen gathered Tim's story gently. Their mother Diane was a single parent fighting addiction. She had been clean for 6 months, trying hard. But recently she had relapsed. That afternoon she had walked her children to the park, set them on a bench, said she'd be back in 10 minutes, and vanished, purse, phone, everything. Tim had stayed because she told him to stay. He'd held his baby sister through the darkening afternoon and into the night because his mother had given him an instruction, and he honoured it even as everything around him fell apart. Dr. Richardson came out with measured calm, moderate hypothermia. Responding well. Sarah would need overnight hospital monitoring, but would make a full recovery. Tim had mild frostbite on his fingers. A tough kid, the doctor said, with something that sounded like genuine admiration. At the hospital, Thomas sat beside Tim in the waiting room. The boy was still wearing Thomas's coat, which he refused to give up. Thomas? What's going to happen to us? If Mum doesn't come back, where will we go? Thomas knew the system. He knew about overburdened caseworkers and how siblings sometimes get separated when no single home has room for two. He thought about Emma, safe in California. He thought about his apartment, clean and silent and waiting. I don't know, he said, but I promise you this. I will make sure you and Sarah stay together, whatever it takes. Detective Chen returned with news. Diane had been found several blocks from the park, arrested while attempting to buy drugs. She was incoherent. She barely remembered leaving her children. The children will need placement, the detective said. Child services is stretched, especially this time of year. We're looking for a home that can take both kids, but she didn't finish. What if I took them? The room went quiet. You're a single man with no experience raising two children in crisis, Detective Chen said carefully. I have a daughter. I raised her through her first 3 years. I'm not saying permanently, just temporarily, until a proper assessment is done. They're comfortable with me. I have the space and the resources. They've been through enough tonight. More strangeness, more separation, that's more damage. He looked at Tim, who was watching with an expression so full of hope it was almost unbearable to hold. Let me help. It took 4 hours. A home inspection. Endless phone calls. Every favour Thomas had been saving for business emergencies, spent instead on 2 children he had met 3 hours ago. At 3 a.m, he drove home with them both asleep in the back seat. Sarah in a hospital car seat. Tim buckled beside her, with one hand resting on her carrier, even in sleep, guarding her even while unconscious. Thomas looked at them in the rearview mirror and thought, what have I done? 24 hours ago, his biggest concern was a quarterly earnings report. The weeks that followed gave him a crash course in everything he thought he'd left behind. He hired a nanny. He met with a child psychologist. He relearned bottles and diapers. He learned that Tim had nightmares about the cold and needed a nightlight and someone to check on him in the dark. He learned that Sarah had extraordinary lungs when hungry. He learned that Tim Reed at a 5th grade level was obsessed with space and science and asked questions about everything with an intensity that made Thomas remember what it felt like to find the world genuinely astonishing. He also learned something about himself he had buried under years of strategy and acquisition. He had not stopped wanting a family. He had simply stopped believing he deserved one. 3 weeks later, Thomas sat in family court. The judge reviewed the case over her reading glasses. Child services reported both children thriving. Sarah's paediatrician confirmed normal development with no lasting effects. Timothy was in school, in therapy, doing remarkably well. May I ask why you're doing this? The judge said. You have no legal obligation to these children. Thomas glanced back at Tim, who gave him a small, careful smile. When I found them that night, I helped because that's what any decent person would do. But then, something changed. Tim reminds me what it feels like to be curious about the world, to ask questions without being afraid of the answers, to trust people again even after being hurt. Sarah reminds me that life is fragile and worth protecting. They've given me more than I've given them. I'm doing this because they need a home and I need them. It wasn't traditional. But we became a family. Foster custody was granted. 6 months later, Emma flew in from California, took one look at Tim and Sarah and declared them perfect. She held the baby while Tim walked her through his latest science project and Thomas stood in the doorway watching all of his children and felt something settle in his chest. That had been shifting for years. A year after the night in the park, Diane voluntarily terminated her parental rights. She had gotten sober. She had done the work. And in a supervised meeting arranged by social workers, she looked at Thomas and said quietly, "I want you to adopt them. I want them to have what I can't give them." She asked him to promise they would know she loved them, that she had tried, that her failure was not their fault and they were worth everything. "I promise," Thomas said, "and I'll make sure they know who you are and where they came from. They deserve that truth." There is something in that moment worth sitting with. Diane's greatest act of love was not fighting to keep her children. It was being honest enough about her own limits to let someone else love them fully. Letting go of something you love because holding on would hurt it. That is not giving up. That is one of the hardest forms of courage that exists. The adoption was finalized on a December afternoon, nearly 2 years to the day after Thomas had walked through Henderson Park with his collar up and his mind somewhere else. Entirely. Tim, now 9, held Sarah, now 2, as the judge made it official. That evening Thomas sat in his living room, no longer immaculate and empty, but scattered with blocks and picture books and the soft noise of a life being lived, and watched. Tim helped Sarah build a tower while Emma Video called from California to say goodnight to her siblings. His phone buzzed with messages from the office. There was always another deal, always another meeting. But right now, in this room, none of that was the most important thing. Here is what this story quietly teaches. If you let it, meaning does not arrive on schedule. It shows up in the middle of your commute, in the voice of a frightened child, in a moment you did not plan and cannot control. The question is never whether the moment will come. The question is whether you will slow down long enough to answer it. Thomas walked into that park as a man who had everything and was missing the most important parts of life. He walked out as someone who was about to find them,